Hey guys, tonight we're going to dive into something truly fascinating. The world of the Dark Ages. Imagine walking through a misty, uncertain world where empires have fallen, kings rise and fall, and the future is anyone's guess. Picture the crumbling remnants of the Roman Empire, the roads, the aqueducts, once grand and efficient, now abandoned and in disrepair. The end of the Roman Empire signified the start of a chaotic time, where society began to pick up the pieces and try to move forward, but everything felt like it was stuck in the past. You might think this is the era of knights in shining armour, but not so fast. In reality, this period was less about fairy tales and more about survival. If you were alive back then, the odds are you wouldn't have made it. It was a time when disease, famine and war could wipe out entire villages in the blink of an eye. But we're going to take a walk through this dark world and see what life was really like. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always interesting to hear about where everyone is in the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Dark Ages, also known as the early Middle Ages, began after the fall of the Roman Empire around the 5th century. The great Roman civilization had brought stability to Europe for hundreds of years, with its roads, military and vast network of trade. But when the Western Roman Empire crumbled under the pressure of invasions, economic collapse, and internal strife, Europe entered what would be one of its most tumultuous periods. Cities once filled with life, culture and ideas fell silent. It's hard to imagine today, but there were entire regions where people couldn't read or write, where knowledge and culture from centuries of Roman rule were lost. Historians often describe this time as a dark period because of this intellectual regression, but it wasn't all doom and gloom. This time laid the foundation for the future of Europe, even though many people would be wandering through a world without the conveniences we take for granted. The end of Roman influence meant chaos for many. New tribes like the Germanic Visigoths, Vandals and Franks started to take over former Roman lands. It wasn't as simple as them taking control though. Much of the time these invaders weren't just coming in and ruling, they were merging with local populations, sometimes through violence, other times through diplomacy. This is when you begin to see the start of what we call feudalism. Small kingdoms and territories emerged as the old Roman order collapsed. Think of these new kingdoms like fragmented pieces of a broken mirror. Each shard of the mirror had its own ruler, but none of them could truly make Europe whole again. The centralized power of Rome was gone, and people had to rely on local lords for protection and resources. In a world without reliable infrastructure, most people lived in fear, never knowing when the next invasion might come or whether the food supply would be enough to last the winter. Historians still argue whether this was truly a dark age. Some claim that, while it might have been a tough time, it also fostered the birth of new societies, new cultures, and the rise of Christianity. What is clear is that this period was not one of stability or peace. Instead, it was a time of constant flux, where survival was paramount and the future uncertain. In the next section, we'll look at what life was like for the people who actually had to survive through these tough times. From the lowest peasant to the nobility, the struggle to keep alive during the Dark Ages was no small feat. As you step into the world of the Dark Ages, there's one group you can't ignore: the peasants. If you had been alive during this time, chances are you would have been one. Now, don't get too comfortable imagining the cozy life of a farmer with wide open fields and a peaceful routine. No, life for a peasant wasn't as idyllic as that. In fact, it was filled with endless hard work, little reward, and even less freedom. First, let's set the scene. Imagine waking up at dawn, the cold air biting at your skin. Your home is a modest one-room cottage made from wattle and daub, a type of mud and straw construction. It's drafty, and the floor is just dirt, no fancy tiles or carpets here. You've been working the land for as long as you can remember. The sun barely rises when you're already outside, dragging your weary body through a day that won't end until well after sunset. You don't get weekends off. No vacations and no paid time off for illness. Your life is about survival. Everything you do, every movement, every action, is about ensuring that you and your family have enough to eat, enough warmth to survive, and enough strength to make it through another day. As a peasant, you're tied to the land, not by choice but by necessity. You don't own the land you work on. It belongs to a local lord who gives you the right to farm a small patch of it in exchange for a hefty portion of your harvest. You're not free to move around, and you certainly don't get to make decisions about what you do with your life. Your lord controls your fate. It's not uncommon for peasants to never travel farther than a few miles from their village, and even then only on rare occasions. Life on the farm is all-consuming. Your day begins with the animals, feeding them, cleaning their stalls, and making sure they're safe from predators. After that, it's off to the fields to sow or harvest crops, depending on the season. Wheat, barley, oats. These were the staples that kept people alive. But the life of a peasant wasn't just about growing food for yourself. You had to give a large portion of your harvest to your lord, and that's before you even think about paying taxes to the church. It's not hard to see why many peasants lived on the edge of poverty, constantly struggling to scrape together enough food to eat. Most people lived in a state of barely surviving, with little hope of ever escaping this cycle. And that's not even considering the diseases and dangers that would often wipe out whole communities. The living conditions were harsh. No modern sanitation, no antibiotics, no knowledge of germs. Life expectancy was short. In fact, most peasants didn't live much longer than their mid-30s. Death from disease, accidents, or malnutrition was common. If you were lucky enough to survive childhood, you were likely to spend most of your life in a constant battle against illness, injury, and hunger. Historians still argue whether peasants during this time lived worse lives than those in later periods. Some believe that the peasant life in the Dark Ages was just a natural part of the medieval system that was ultimately necessary for the functioning of feudal society. Others point to the fact that many peasants had more freedom and autonomy later on, particularly as towns began to develop and the feudal system evolved. Still, there's no denying that life in the Dark Ages was brutal for the majority of people. But what about the occasional glimmers of relief? Despite the long days of grueling labour, peasants did find moments of reprieve. Festivals, for example, were a welcome break. These were often tied to the religious calendar and gave peasants a chance to celebrate, drink and dance. It wasn't much, but for 1 or 2 days a year, they could forget about their struggles and enjoy a moment of joy. Feasts were another rare but wonderful part of peasant life. Though they were few and far between, they offered the chance to eat meat, something that was generally out of reach for most peasants. Another aspect of peasant life that might surprise you is the sense of community. Though most peasants lived in small villages, they often had a strong network of mutual support. Life was hard, but people relied on each other to survive. Whether it was helping each other harvest crops, sharing tools, or offering support during difficult times, the bonds between peasants were tight. This communal sense of belonging was one of the few things that made life in the Dark Ages bearable. But don't get too romantic about it. Life as a peasant was still a constant grind. With no education, little to no chance of upward mobility, and constant threats from both the elements and the political structure of the time, peasants were stuck in a life they couldn't escape. They were at the mercy of a system that offered them little and demanded everything. Let's not forget that the social hierarchy of the time placed peasants at the very bottom of the ladder. The world they lived in was one where status and privilege were determined by birth, not ability. While peasants toiled away in the fields, the lords and knights lived in relative comfort. They had homes made of stone, clothes made of fine materials, and access to luxuries that peasants could only dream of. Life for peasants wasn't just hard, it was unfair. And though they might have formed communities and found moments of respite, the harsh realities of medieval life never truly let up. Now, as we shift our focus, we'll look at another facet of medieval society, the knights. These warriors lived lives that seemed, on the surface, to be full of honour and glory. But what was their life really like? Were they truly the noble protectors of the people, or was their world just as brutal and demanding as that of the peasants? Let's explore the world of chivalry, warfare, and the constant struggle for power in the next section. Imagine yourself standing on a muddy battlefield, the clatter of armour ringing in your ears. The air smells of sweat, iron, and the distant stench of horses, and ahead of you, enemies clad in similar gleaming armour are readying for battle. You, however, are no mere foot soldier. You are a knight, sworn to uphold the ideals of chivalry and to defend the realm with your sword. The world you inhabit may seem filled with honour, glory, and heroism, but let me tell you, it's not all shining armour and noble deeds. Being a knight in the Dark Ages was a life of both grandeur and brutal reality. The concept of knighthood began as a military necessity, but it quickly grew to encompass ideals of honour, duty, and service. Knights were meant to be the defenders of the weak, the protectors of their lord's lands, and the embodiment of noble virtues. You've probably heard stories of knights rescuing damsels in distress, slaying dragons, or embarking on glorious quests. However, reality wasn't quite as fairy tale-like as the legends would suggest. To be a knight, you had to start early. As a young boy, you would begin your training in a noble household. You were expected to learn to ride a horse, master the sword, and become proficient in hand-to-hand combat. But the training didn't stop there. Knights were also trained in the art of courtly manners, learning how to behave in noble circles, speak eloquently, and most importantly how to be a symbol of virtue and honour. If you managed to survive the years of rigorous training, you would eventually be knighted, typically in a religious ceremony. But that knighthood didn't come with the luxury of being a carefree warrior. It came with a burden. Once you were officially a knight, your life was one of service. You were expected to serve your lord loyally, defending his lands and fighting his battles. Unlike today, where most people can choose a job based on their interests or career aspirations, being a knight in the Dark Ages meant that your life and death were often dictated by the whims of those who held power. Knights were often called upon to fight in wars, whether they were defending the kingdom from invading forces or participating in local skirmishes to maintain order. Historians still argue about how much knights actually lived up to the ideals of chivalry. Some believe that the chivalric code, emphasising bravery, honour and courtesy, was largely symbolic, a set of lofty ideals that knights couldn't always live up to in the chaos of battle. Others argue that knights were indeed more virtuous than their peers, serving as an example of noble behaviour in an otherwise violent and lawless society. One thing is clear. Even the most idealistic knights had to grapple with the harsh realities of medieval warfare. As a knight, you were expected to be a fearless warrior, always ready to fight at a moment's notice. Battles were often brutal and bloody, and the battlefield was a place where few survived unscathed. Knights were at the forefront of these wars, and their skill in combat was often the deciding factor between victory and defeat. Armour, once a symbol of protection, became heavier and more cumbersome as the centuries wore on, leading knights to struggle with exhaustion and limited mobility during long campaigns. The sword, lance, and shield were essential to a knight's arsenal, but so were tactics, discipline, and leadership. Being a knight wasn't just about fighting, it was about leading men into battle, making strategic decisions, and maintaining morale during the most difficult of times. When knights weren't on the battlefield, they were often engaged in other aspects of medieval life. The pursuit of honour wasn't limited to warfare. It extended to courtly manners, etiquette, and even love. The famous code of chivalry demanded that knights respect and protect women, though this was often more a concept than a practiced reality. Courtly love was a common theme in the literature of the time, with knights often undertaking quests to prove their devotion to a lady. But, like many aspects of knighthood, these tales were more romanticised than they were based in fact. While some knights undoubtedly upheld these ideals, others were known to be just as ruthless and self-serving as the enemies they fought. But despite the pomp and ceremony of their world, knights also faced immense danger. The life expectancy of a knight was far shorter than we might expect, thanks to the constant state of war that characterised much of the Dark Ages. Knights were often the first to fall in battle, and even if they survived the wars, life after combat could be grim, A knight who returned from battle often found himself returning to a society that had little to offer him in terms of employment, support, or respect. Even if you survived the physical wounds of war, the mental scars could be just as crippling. Yet the knight's life was also marked by moments of camaraderie and brotherhood. Knights formed close bonds with their fellow soldiers, often living together in castles or fortresses, away from the rest of society. This tight-knit group was essential to maintaining the discipline required to survive in battle. In times of peace, knights might also serve as advisors to the king or noble lords, offering counsel on matters of state, law, and governance. Despite the hardships, there was always the possibility of rising in status. A knight who proved himself in battle could receive land, titles, or wealth. But like peasants, knights were often at the mercy of a system that favoured birthright over merit. The nobility, including the knights, were bound by a social structure that placed the wealth and power of the few above the needs of the many. This hierarchical society could offer little in terms of personal freedom, even for someone as prestigious as a knight. Historians often debate the true role of knights in medieval society. Were they heroic figures who upheld the ideals of chivalry and honour, or were they simply mercenaries fighting for power, wealth, and glory? Some view knights as a necessary part of medieval society, maintaining order and protecting the realm from invaders, while others see them as tools of an oppressive feudal system. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Knights were a product of the medieval world, caught between the ideals of their noble birth and the harsh realities of the world they inhabited. Now, let's shift gears and take a closer look at the religious world of the Dark Ages. As knights fought for power, peasants struggled for survival, and lords sought to maintain their authority, the Church stood at the centre of medieval life. The power of the Catholic Church during the Dark Ages cannot be overstated, but what role did it play in shaping society, and how did its influence affect those living under its rule? We'll explore this next. In the Dark Ages, one force towered over everything: the Church. Imagine yourself walking through a medieval village or town. The first thing you'd probably notice is the Grand Cathedral, its towering spires scraping the heavens. Whether you were in a bustling town or a humble village, chances are your life was deeply influenced by the Church in ways that would seem almost impossible to imagine today. The Church wasn't just a place of worship, it was the centre of knowledge, law, politics, and even the very structure of everyday life. Whether you liked it or not, the Catholic Church held a grip on medieval Europe that few could escape. Life for most people revolved around the church. You'd probably start your day with prayers, and the church bell would mark the hours of the day, calling you to Mass or reminding you of your obligations. If you lived in a town or village, the local priest was often the most educated person you'd ever meet. He could read, write, and interpret the scriptures, something that the average peasant couldn't do. Education was limited, and the church held almost all the knowledge. Libraries were rare, and any sort of learning that wasn't connected to religion was often frowned upon or outright banned. But the church wasn't just about religion. It was deeply entrenched in every aspect of life, including politics. Bishops and cardinals weren't just spiritual leaders, they were political leaders too, often wielding more power than the kings themselves. In fact, some historians argue that the Pope, as the head of the Catholic Church, held as much, if not more, power than any king during the Dark Ages. When a king faced a political crisis, it was often the Pope whom they sought out for counsel or support. The Church's power over kings was not just in religious matters, but also in secular affairs. Kings had to bow to the Pope's authority, sometimes even to the point of submitting to the Church's judgment in matters of law and governance. The Church was also the main enforcer of law. It created its own system of canon law, which was enforced alongside local laws, and it had the power to excommunicate people who defied its teachings or laws. Excommunication, in medieval times, was the ultimate punishment. It meant you were cut off from the community, and your soul was damned. Without the sacraments, like communion or last rites, your chances of entering heaven were slim. Being excommunicated wasn't just about religious punishment, It could ruin your life entirely. Without the blessing of the church, you couldn't marry and you couldn't be buried in consecrated ground. It was social death, and it was a tool the church used to control people and keep them in line. In fact, religion permeated every aspect of medieval life. There was no concept of a secular society. The church was at the heart of everything. Holidays, festivals, and even the timing of work were dictated by religious calendars. In the Dark Ages, much of the year was divided into periods of fasting, penance, and prayer. Your life wasn't your own. It was owned by the rhythms of the religious year. There were feast days to celebrate saints and holy events, and Lent, the period of fasting and reflection, marked the most solemn part of the year. Everything from your diet to the clothes you wore was impacted by the religious calendar. Historians still argue whether the church's influence was a force for good or evil during the Dark Ages. On one hand, the church provided stability in an otherwise turbulent and chaotic world. It offered people a sense of community and a way to make sense of the suffering they endured. It was the church that preserved many of the works of ancient scholars and kept the light of knowledge alive during a time when much of Europe was plunged into ignorance. But on the other hand, the church also held immense power over people's lives, often wielding it in oppressive ways. It was the church that led the Crusades, sending knights to fight in faraway lands. It was the church that sanctioned inquisitions and witch hunts. It was the church that often crushed any attempts at reform or alternative ideas, fearing that such things would undermine its authority. The clergy became incredibly wealthy, with vast land holdings, while the peasants lived in poverty. This stark contrast in wealth led to a growing resentment among the lower classes. The church was also deeply entangled in the political struggles of the time. While kings were often at the mercy of the Pope, the church was not without its own internal battles for power. Bishops and cardinals fought for influence, and popes often had to navigate complex political landscapes, especially in the context of the growing power of monarchies. The church's power wasn't just about spiritual leadership. It was a key player in the political drama of the Dark Ages. The political and religious worlds were inseparable, and it's hard to separate the church's religious mission from its political ambitions. But not everything in the church was as dark and oppressive as it might seem. For many people, the church provided comfort and hope in times of distress. It was the place where you went for solace when your crops failed, when your family was sick, or when you lost a loved one. The church offered the promise of eternal life, and for many people in the Dark Ages, that was a comfort that made the harshness of their earthly lives more bearable. The church was also a centre of charity. Monasteries and abbeys became places where the poor could find food, shelter, and medical care. Monks and nuns worked to help the needy, and the religious orders played an important role in preserving knowledge and culture during a time when literacy rates were low. They transcribed ancient texts, created art, and kept the flame of learning alive. The church was, in some ways, a lifeline in the darkest of times. In our next section, we'll move on from the power and influence of the church and explore another darker aspect of the Dark Ages, the Black Plague. This terrible disease would ravage Europe, wiping out entire populations and changing the course of history forever. But how did it spread, and what impact did it have on medieval society? Let's dive into the chaos of the Black Death and its lasting effects. The Black Plague, perhaps the single most devastating event in medieval history. If you were alive in the mid-14th century, this disease would have brought you face to face with death in a way few could have imagined. You'd hear whispers on the streets, rumours of strange sicknesses spreading from town to town, and then, suddenly, your own village is not immune. It's here. The terror is palpable. One minute someone is walking down the street, and the next minute they're dead. A few days at most. That's the Black Plague for you. The exact origins of the plague are still debated by historians, but what is known is that the disease arrived in Europe via the Silk Road, brought by traders and their caravans. The plague spread rapidly along trade routes, carried by rats and fleas that travelled with the goods. If you lived in a bustling medieval town, chances are you would have lived in close quarters with animals, rats, chickens, and other livestock. The fleas carried by these rats carried the bacteria Yersinia pestis, the culprit behind the plague. Infected fleas would bite humans, injecting bacteria into the bloodstream. The first symptoms were unmistakable. The initial fever was followed by swelling of the lymph nodes, known as buboes, which became painfully inflamed. The skin would turn a dark, mottled colour as the blood vessels collapsed, and within days the person would be dead. The disease could spread quickly, wiping out entire families and even entire communities. You might walk through your village and see the familiar faces of neighbours and friends, only to find that in a matter of days many of them had succumbed to the plague. Entire villages were emptied as people either fled or perished. It didn't matter if you were a noble or a peasant. The plague didn't discriminate. Imagine the confusion and fear. You wouldn't have known what caused the disease. Was it divine punishment for sin? Was it the work of witches or dark magic? No one knew for sure, but many turned to the church for answers. The church tried to offer solace, but it was powerless against the spread of disease. Some turned to extreme measures, such as flagellants. Groups of people who publicly whipped themselves in an attempt to appease God, believing that the plague was a punishment for humanity's sins. Others sought magic, charms and potions, hoping for a miracle. But none of these efforts could stop the plague. The death toll was staggering. Historians estimate that as many as 25 million people died in Europe alone, wiping out a third to half of the population in some areas. Towns and villages were left desolate, and trade routes ground to a halt. The economic impact was disastrous, with labour shortages leading to famine and rising prices. In some places the dead were buried in mass graves, hastily thrown together with no regard for the dead's dignity. As you walk through these once thriving communities, the silence would have been deafening. The normal hum of life, children playing, farmers working, merchants haggling, was replaced by an eerie stillness, broken only by the mournful wail of someone who had lost a loved one. But the plague didn't just ravage populations, it also caused a profound shift in society. The massive death toll disrupted the feudal system in ways that would change the course of history. With so many workers gone, the surviving peasants found themselves in a more powerful position. They could demand higher wages, and in some areas, they could negotiate for better living conditions. For a brief moment, it seemed like the peasants might escape the harsh grip of feudalism. However, as the plague passed and the population began to recover, the lords and the church moved to reassert control, but the social structure had been irreparably shaken. Historians still argue over the longer-term effects of the plague. Some claim that the demographic catastrophe helped accelerate the transition from feudalism to more modern forms of society, while others argue that the social and economic structures in place before the plague were so deeply entrenched that the changes were only temporary. What is clear, however, is that the Black Plague left its mark. The survivors carried with them a deep sense of trauma and loss. Entire families had vanished. Towns had been depopulated. The very fabric of society had been torn apart. But the plague wasn't the only disease to strike Europe during this time. Leprosy, smallpox, and other infectious diseases were also rampant. Life expectancy in the Dark Ages was low, and disease was a constant threat. Even if you managed to survive the Black Plague, you were still at risk from other illnesses. Medical knowledge was rudimentary at best, and without antibiotics, there was little hope for anyone who fell ill. The lack of hygiene and understanding of disease meant that many people were constantly living in fear of the next outbreak. And as if disease wasn't enough, famine was always lurking on the horizon. Poor harvests, bad weather, and crop failures meant that food was scarce, and many people went hungry for long stretches of time. Imagine the desperation as you struggle to find enough food to survive, knowing that your next meal was never guaranteed. It was a life defined by uncertainty and hardship. If the plague didn't take you, the next bad harvest might. But despite all the death and destruction, the Black Plague wasn't the end of the world. In the years following the pandemic, Europe began to rebuild. The population slowly grew again, and with it, new ideas began to take root. The disruptions caused by the plague helped pave the way for the rise of the Renaissance. In many ways, the Black Plague, while horrific, served as a catalyst for change. ushering in new ways of thinking, new social structures, and a greater emphasis on human progress. As we move forward in the story of the Dark Ages, we'll turn our attention to another crucial aspect of medieval life: the castles and fortresses that dotted the landscape. While peasants were struggling to survive, the nobility and knights built massive castles to defend themselves from threats. But what was life like inside these stone fortresses? Were they the bastions of safety they seemed to be, or were they just as dangerous as the world outside their walls? Let's dive into the world of castles and siege warfare in the next section. Castles. They are perhaps the most iconic symbols of the medieval world, towering structures that seem to stand the test of time, casting long shadows over the land. If you had lived in the Dark Ages, you might have gazed upon these magnificent fortresses and thought of them as invincible. After all, they were designed to protect you from the dangers of the outside world, whether that danger came from roving bands of marauders, rival lords, or armies marching toward your gate. But despite their imposing appearance, castles were not as secure or unassailable as they seemed. In fact, life inside these stone fortresses could be just as dangerous as life on the outside. Imagine standing at the base of a medieval castle, its stone walls stretching high above you. The castle was designed to intimidate. The thick, towering walls were built to withstand siege weapons like catapults and trebuchets. The high towers allowed archers and lookouts to survey the surrounding land, watching for any signs of enemy movement. The drawbridge would be pulled up, and the moat, if there was one, would separate you from the outside world, making it difficult for any attackers to get close. But while the castle's exterior might have seemed impenetrable, the reality inside could be very different. Life within a medieval castle was filled with contradictions. On the one hand, the castle was meant to be a haven, a place of safety for the lord and his family. It was where you would eat, sleep, and socialize, away from the dangers of the outside world. But it was also a place of constant vigilance. The castle was a military outpost as much as it was a home. Knights, soldiers, and servants filled the halls, always on alert for potential attacks. If you were a knight or a nobleman, your life was often consumed with the duty to defend your home and your lands, making sure that your family and your subjects were safe from the various threats that lurked beyond the walls. But even inside the castle, the dangers were ever present. The rooms were often cold, dark, and uncomfortable, with few luxuries beyond what was absolutely necessary for survival. The Great Hall, where you would gather with family and guests, had no heating, just a large hearth in the centre to warm the room. But even that couldn't stave off the chill of the stone walls. The bedrooms were small, sparsely furnished, and often shared by multiple people. The castle was designed for defence, not comfort, and if you were a servant, life inside the castle could be even harder, as you worked long hours to maintain the fortress and serve the lord and his family. Even the best-built castles were not immune to attack. Medieval warfare was brutal, and when enemies came to lay siege to a castle, they brought with them a variety of terrifying tools. Siege weapons like battering rams, trebuchets, and siege towers could break down the massive stone walls. If attackers could get close enough, they might set fire to the castle's wooden gates, or use ladders to scale the walls. The defenders inside would try to hold off the attackers with arrows, boiling oil and stones, but it wasn't always enough. Castles were designed to withstand attacks for a while, but the defenders were often at the mercy of the attackers' persistence. If you were inside the castle, you would need to be prepared for a long siege. Food supplies would quickly dwindle, and the longer the siege lasted, the more desperate the situation became. Some castles were even abandoned after long periods of siege, their once proud walls crumbling as they were slowly overtaken by the enemy. Siege warfare was not just about the physical destruction of the castle, it was also about psychological warfare. The attackers would often attempt to starve the defenders out, cutting off their supply lines and waiting for them to surrender. Inside the castle, life would become unbearable. The constant pressure and fear of attack took a toll on both the defenders and their families. If you were a noble or a knight, you would have to balance your responsibilities to your family with the harsh reality of the siege. It was a world of constant stress, where every decision could mean the difference between life and death. And it wasn't just during sieges that castles could be dangerous. Life inside could also be fraught with internal conflict. Castles were often places of power struggles, where noble families fought for control. Political intrigue, betrayal and backstabbing were common within the castle walls, as members of rival families or factions vied for control of the estate. If you were a noble living in a castle, you would have to be constantly on your guard, watching your back for those who might seek to undermine your position. This kind of treachery was just as dangerous as the threat of external attack. On the flip side, the castle also represented power and prestige. For the lord and his family, it was a symbol of their dominance. Castles were often grand structures, decorated with the finest materials, and used as places of entertainment, where banquets and feasts were held. It was a place to show off wealth, power and influence, but it could also be a place where power was abused. Lords would use their castles to assert control over their subjects, collecting taxes, demanding loyalty, and punishing those who disobeyed. Life for peasants under the rule of a castle lord was often harsh, as they were expected to work the land and serve the lord in exchange for protection. But in exchange for this protection, the peasants had to offer their labour, their food, and their allegiance. It was a constant give and take, with the lord at the top of the hierarchy and the peasants at the bottom. Despite all the grandeur and might of these castles, they were not invulnerable. Throughout the Dark Ages, castles were constantly evolving, growing larger and more complex as new technologies and warfare strategies emerged. In the early medieval period, castles were simple fortifications made of wood, but as time passed, they evolved into massive stone structures designed to withstand the increasing power of siege warfare. The rise of gunpowder in the late medieval period eventually rendered many traditional castles obsolete, but during the Dark Ages, they represented the pinnacle of defensive architecture. Even as these stone fortresses fell to the ravages of time, their legacy lived on. Today, when we look at castles, whether they're in Europe or in history books, we see more than just relics of a distant past. We see symbols of the medieval world's complex interplay of power, protection, fear and luxury. Castles were the heart of medieval life, and for the people who lived in them, they represented both safety and danger, luxury and hardship, wealth and loss. Next, let's turn our attention to medieval towns and markets, the lifeblood of the economy during the Dark Ages. While the nobility lived in their castles, the rest of society gathered in bustling towns, where life was just as lively, albeit much more chaotic. These towns were centres of trade, culture and activity, and though they were often stinky, overcrowded and prone to outbreaks of disease, they were where the action happened. Join me as we dive into the world of medieval markets and take a closer look at the daily life of those who lived in the town. Medieval towns were like little ecosystems in their own right, full of life, noise and a constant buzz of activity. Picture yourself walking down one of the narrow cobblestone streets, lined with timber-framed buildings, their thatched roofs sloping steeply. The air is filled with a mixture of sounds, the clattering of hammers, the barking of dogs, and the chatter of people haggling in the market. The scents are overwhelming, fresh bread baking in one corner, fish being sold in another, and the unmistakable stench of human waste that often lingered in the streets. Towns during the Dark Ages were centres of commerce, though they were far from the bustling metropolises we know today. Towns were often situated near rivers or along major trade routes, making them strategic hubs for merchants and travellers. If you lived in one of these towns, your life would be tightly bound to its rhythms. The town square was usually the heart of the action. This is where the market took place. It was a place of commerce where people would buy and sell goods ranging from food to clothing to tools and weapons. But if you were a commoner, like most people, your life was a constant balancing act between survival and making a living in this crowded, noisy world. If you were a merchant, you'd have a stall or booth in the town square where you would sell your goods. Perhaps you would sell woolen cloth, or maybe you were a blacksmith, peddling iron tools. There was no large-scale retail operation. Everything was done on a much smaller scale. Merchants would often travel from one town to another, hoping to find good deals and make a profit. You'd probably do a lot of bartering, exchanging goods instead of using money, especially if you were just a lowly peasant. Money was often scarce, and while the towns were bustling with activity, much of the population still relied on the local lord or church for protection, sustenance, and guidance. You wouldn't have much freedom to move around or make a lot of decisions on your own. Towns were generally overcrowded, which was both a cause and a result of the lack of modern sanitation. With limited infrastructure, people often dumped their waste into the streets, creating an environment ripe for disease. And because towns were hubs of trade, the movement of goods also meant the movement of disease. The most famous, of course, was the Black Plague, which spread rapidly in towns and cities. Crowded living conditions, poor hygiene, and a lack of understanding about germs made the spread of disease almost inevitable. Towns were essentially petri dishes for sickness, and the overcrowding often meant that the most vulnerable members of society, children, the elderly, and the poor, were hit the hardest. Imagine living in a medieval town where you're constantly aware of the threat of disease, crime, and political upheaval. While the lord of the castle might live in relative comfort and safety, your life is far more precarious. Towns could be dangerous places, especially at night. With little policing or law enforcement, crime was rampant. Thieves, bandits, and other unsavoury characters roamed the streets, and you would have to be careful not to fall victim to their attacks. Sometimes the crime wasn't just from outsiders. There were occasional uprisings or even violent disputes between rival families or guilds. There was always tension between the common folk and the ruling class, and at times, those tensions would boil over into violence. But even with all these dangers, the town was where you went for everything. It was where you went to buy food, to find work, and to meet other people. As a peasant, you might live in a small cottage outside the walls of the town, but your daily trips into the market were essential for surviving. You would bring whatever you had to trade, perhaps a few eggs, some vegetables, or a piece of leather, and hope that it would be enough to feed your family for the week. You'd probably spend most of your time working the fields or taking care of animals, but without the market you'd be unable to get the goods you needed to survive. One of the more interesting aspects of medieval towns was the guild system. Guilds were associations of tradespeople or craftsmen who worked together to protect their interests and ensure that their skills were passed down to future generations. If you were a blacksmith, carpenter, or weaver, you would likely belong to a guild. The guild set standards for work, ensured fair pricing, and offered training for apprentices who wanted to learn the trade. In many ways, the guild system was a precursor to modern unions. But while the guilds did provide protection for workers, they could also be incredibly exclusive, often limiting access to their membership and dictating the terms of work. As a member of the town's lower classes, your life would be dominated by a constant cycle of work, trade, and survival. You'd be part of a larger interconnected network, but your social mobility would be limited. Towns were where people lived, worked, and died, but they were also places of immense poverty. While some merchants, artisans, and lords lived comfortably, the majority of the population lived in constant struggle. It's difficult to imagine just how harsh life could be, particularly in the winter months when food was scarce, and the cold seeped into even the most well-built homes. Towns could also be places of great cultural significance. While they were dirty, chaotic, and filled with poverty, they were also the homes of writers, scholars, and artists. If you lived in a larger town, you might be lucky enough to see plays, hear music, or learn new ideas. The influence of the church was always present, and town life often revolved around religious events and festivals. These events were an opportunity for the people to come together, to take a break from their daily struggles and to celebrate life, even if only for a day. But even as the Dark Ages slowly moved into the High Middle Ages, towns didn't change much. They remained places of industry, poverty, and struggle, with only small changes in infrastructure and lifestyle. It wasn't until the later Middle Ages, when towns began to grow and develop into cities, that the urban landscape started to transform. It was only then that the gradual evolution of medieval life began to take hold, leading into the more sophisticated urban environments of the Renaissance. The medieval market, for all its grime and danger, was the beating heart of medieval society. It was a place where the people came together, where goods were exchanged, and where the rhythms of everyday life unfolded. If you had lived back then, it's likely you would have spent much of your time in this marketplace, struggling to survive trading and bartering for what little you could get. In the next section, we'll look at the rise of monarchies and the power struggles that defined the political landscape of the Dark Ages. Kings and queens, their courts and intrigue, shaped the world around them, often using their castles as symbols of their power. It's time to delve into the world of royalty and the political games that defined this chaotic time. As we shift our gaze from the hustle and bustle of medieval towns and markets, we find ourselves looking up at the towering castles once again. These fortresses, home to the kings, queens, and nobility of the Dark Ages, were not just physical structures. They were symbols of power, control, and domination. But what was it really like to be a monarch during the Dark Ages? What did it mean to sit on the throne and wield such immense power in a world that was constantly changing, filled with war, betrayal, and the constant quest for more land? Imagine stepping into the grand hall of a medieval castle. You're not just walking into a room, you're entering a world of wealth and power. The walls are draped with rich tapestries, and a roaring fire crackles in the hearth. The ruler of this castle, a king or queen, stands at the centre of it all. The air is thick with the weight of their authority, but that authority is never truly secure. The king or queen is surrounded by advisors, nobles, and knights, all vying for influence, and you can feel the tension in the room. The throne itself is a symbol of power, but it's also a reminder of just how precarious that power really is. Monarchs in the Dark Ages were faced with a constant struggle to maintain control. Unlike modern monarchs, who are often limited by constitutional laws and checks on their power, medieval kings and queens ruled in a time when their word was law. They had the ability to raise armies, levy taxes, and command loyalty from their subjects. But with that power came immense responsibility and immense danger. Kings were constantly faced with the threat of rebellion, assassination, and betrayal. The political landscape was always shifting, with rival factions, ambitious nobles, and rebellious vassals all eager to seize power. The life of a medieval king or queen was marked by both luxury and peril. On one hand, monarchs lived in grand castles, surrounded by riches, fine foods, and servants. They had access to the best that the medieval world had to offer. They could commission beautiful works of art, hold lavish feasts, and surround themselves with the finest fabrics and jewellery. But beneath the surface, life in the royal court was far from easy. Power was constantly in flux, and maintaining control was a full-time job. Monarchs had to be shrewd diplomats, military strategists, and sometimes even ruthless in their dealings with their subjects and rivals. In this world of constant power struggles, betrayal was a common currency. A king's closest advisors could be plotting against him, and even family members might be willing to stab him in the back to claim the throne. The concept of loyalty was fickle, and in times of unrest, a king's own knights or lords could turn on him in pursuit of their own ambition. The power of a monarch was fragile, and it was not unusual for kings and queens to find themselves caught up in a web of court intrigue, surrounded by those who sought to undermine them. Historians still argue about the role of monarchs during the Dark Ages. Some view them as the ultimate authority, the defenders of the realm, while others see them as tyrants who abused their power for personal gain. Some monarchs, like Charlemagne or Alfred the Great, are remembered as great leaders who helped shape the course of history. But many others, especially during times of feudal fragmentation, were less able to control their lands and people. As powerful as they were, kings and queens were often limited by the resources available to them. Unlike today's monarchs, they didn't have standing armies at their disposal, or the ability to raise taxes easily. Much of their power was based on their relationships with other nobles, and if those relationships soured, so did their reign. Being a monarch also meant having to manage a vast network of vassals and knights, each of whom had their own allegiances and interests. The feudal system that characterized much of the Dark Ages was built on the exchange of land and loyalty. The king or queen would grant land known as fiefs, to knights and nobles in exchange for military service. But while this system worked to build power, it also created constant tensions between the monarchs and their vassals. If a noble felt that he wasn't receiving his due share, or that a monarch was weak, he might turn against the king and seek to create his own power base. In fact, many medieval kings faced rebellions from their own nobles. These uprisings weren't just political, they were personal. Knights who had sworn loyalty to a king might break their oaths and seek to carve out their own fiefdoms. These rebellions were often bloody and destructive, and they could quickly weaken a monarch's control over their kingdom. It wasn't unusual for rival factions to wage war against one another in a constant struggle for dominance. The political Game of Thrones wasn't just about military might. It was about clever alliances, strategic marriages, and sometimes sheer luck. If a monarch wasn't able to maintain control, he could quickly lose his throne and even his life. But despite these threats, monarchs were often adored by their subjects. The king or queen was a figurehead of stability, a symbol of the unity and strength of the kingdom. Whether they were admired or feared, the monarch was the embodiment of the kingdom's power and identity. In times of peace, the royal court could be a place of cultural flourishing, with nobles commissioning beautiful works of art and literature. In times of war, the monarch would lead their army into battle, symbolizing the strength and determination of the people. The image of the king or queen was often one of grandeur, meant to inspire loyalty and pride in their subjects. However, the role of monarchs was not without its contradictions. While kings and queens were the figureheads of their realm, their power was always subject to the shifting tides of history. A king might be overthrown by his own family, a lord might rise up and take his throne, or an invading force might bring an end to a royal dynasty. As powerful as monarchs were, they were often just one misstep away from losing everything. Their position, much like the castles they lived in, could be precarious. The political landscape of the Dark Ages was one of constant upheaval, and even the most powerful monarchs couldn't afford to be complacent. The legacy of these monarchs is still a matter of debate. Some were remembered as great leaders who helped unify their people, while others were remembered for their cruelty or ineptitude. What is clear, however, is that the monarchy played a central role in shaping the medieval world. It was the monarchy that provided stability, and it was the monarchy that was often responsible for the downfall of entire dynasties. In many ways, the political battles fought by kings and queens during the Dark Ages set the stage for the power struggles that would unfold in the centuries to come. Now that we've seen the power struggles within the royal courts, let's move on to a different aspect of medieval life, the role of women in the Dark Ages. How did women navigate this male-dominated world? Were they passive victims, or did they find ways to wield influence and power in their own right? Let's explore the often overlooked but essential role women played in shaping medieval society. The role of women in the Dark Ages might surprise you. When we think of medieval women, we often picture them as subjugated by the harsh, patriarchal structures of society, stuck in the shadows of history. But if you dig a little deeper, you'll find that women were, in fact, active participants in medieval life, shaping society in ways that are often overlooked. The medieval world was, of course, a male-dominated place. Laws were crafted by men, and men held the majority of the power. Kings, knights, and lords were the public figures who defined the course of history. Yet, women played crucial roles in both public and private spheres, navigating complex and sometimes perilous social systems. While many women were bound by family duties and societal expectations, some women managed to wield significant influence both in the family and beyond. Let's start by imagining the life of a noblewoman. If you were a woman born into the noble class, you would have been raised with the expectation that you would marry for political alliances, secure your family's legacy, and bear children, preferably male heirs. Your life was largely defined by your father's or husband's wealth and social status. Much like the men around you, you would have been expected to uphold the family name and ensure its success. However, despite the constraints, noble women were far from powerless. A noblewoman's role was multifaceted. She was responsible for managing the household, which could include overseeing servants, controlling the food supply and managing finances. While her husband might be off at war or busy with political affairs, she would be in charge of running the day-to-day operations of the estate. In times of conflict, it was often the women who were left to hold down the fort, managing defences and making decisions in the absence of their husbands. Some women even served as regents, taking control of the kingdom when their husbands or sons were too young to rule. It wasn't uncommon for noble women to wield significant power within their own households. Take the case of Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the medieval period. Eleanor was not just a queen, she was an independent, politically astute figure who controlled vast lands and territories in her own right. She married King Louis VII of France, and later Henry II of England, both of which solidified her political power. But she didn't just sit idly by in the shadow of her husbands. Eleanor was active in political affairs, playing a key role in the governance of her lands and engaging in diplomatic matters. When she was dissatisfied with Henry II, she even led a rebellion against him, showing that, even in the male-dominated medieval world, women could, and did, take matters into their own hands when necessary. Not all noble women had the same political clout as Eleanor, but many wielded power in other ways. The monastery, for example, became a powerful institution for women. Women who chose religious life often held significant influence within the confines of the convent. Some of the most learned women of the Dark Ages were nuns. They managed their own abbeys, presided over religious ceremonies, and often had access to education, an opportunity that was rare for most women. The abbey was, in many ways, a parallel society where women could have control over their lives and contribute to the intellectual and religious fabric of the time. But what about the majority of women, the ones living in the lower classes? The life of a peasant woman was, in many ways, defined by her ability to manage a household, farm the land, and support her family. Women were expected to work just as hard as men in the fields, sowing, harvesting, and taking care of animals. They were also responsible for maintaining the household, cooking, cleaning, and raising children. Life for peasant women was marked by toil, but their role in the household was absolutely vital to the survival of their families. For peasant women, their work was often less about power and more about survival. The daily grind of the life was physically demanding, but it also required a certain kind of resilience and strength. Women in rural communities often had to work side by side with their husbands and children to ensure that there was enough food to eat and that the home was maintained. While they might not have wielded the political power of noble women, they were often the backbone of their communities. Without their contributions, the entire feudal system would have crumbled. The impact of women in medieval society wasn't just confined to the household or the monastery either. Women played important roles in agriculture, the economy, and the workforce. Some women worked as artisans, producing textiles, pottery, and other goods. They were also involved in trade, selling goods at local markets or even travelling between towns to sell their wares. The role of women in these trades and crafts was often overlooked, but without their contributions the economy would not have functioned. Some women also worked as midwives or healers, using herbal remedies and traditional knowledge to care for the sick. Women were also central to the spiritual life of the medieval world. Christianity had a profound impact on medieval society, and women played important roles in the spread of Christian teachings. Many women became saints, revered for their piety, acts of charity, and religious devotion. These women were not just figures in religious texts, they were seen as role models for other women to follow. The lives of saints like St. Catherine of Siena and St. Hildegard of Bingen demonstrated that women could achieve greatness in the spiritual realm. And it wasn't just the nobility who followed these religious examples. Many lower-class women also sought to live holy lives, often in convents or monasteries, where they could find peace and purpose. But life for medieval women was far from perfect. They faced numerous challenges, from the constant threat of disease and war to the rigid social expectations that limited their freedom. Many women were denied the same rights and opportunities as men. Marriage, for example, was often not a matter of love but of political necessity, and many women had little control over who they would marry. Inheritance laws favoured men, and women's legal rights were often limited. The idea that women were inferior to men was ingrained in medieval society, and it would take centuries before these societal structures began to change. Historians still argue about the extent to which women were truly empowered during the Dark Ages. Were they largely powerless, confined to the household, or did they find ways to exert influence and control within the limits of their society? The reality is likely a combination of both. Women in the Dark Ages were subject to many of the same pressures and constraints as their male counterparts, but they also found ways to navigate these pressures and assert their importance within the social structure. As we look at the lives of women, we're reminded that the medieval world wasn't just shaped by kings, knights and warriors. It was shaped by the strength, resilience and resourcefulness of women who lived within it. While they may not have wielded the same power as their male counterparts, their influence and contributions were undeniable. Next, we'll move on to one of the most iconic and feared groups of the Dark Ages, the Vikings. These fierce warriors and traders travelled far and wide, leaving an indelible mark on medieval Europe. But what was it really like to be a Viking? Were they just bloodthirsty raiders, or was there more to their story than we've been led to believe? Let's find out. The Vikings. Fearsome warriors, traders, explorers, and to many, a terrifying presence in the medieval world. If you had lived in the Dark Ages, you would have heard whispers of these northern raiders long before they arrived on your shores. With their longships, sleek and fast, the Vikings seemed to appear out of nowhere, sailing down rivers and landing on the coasts of Europe, raiding, pillaging, and leaving destruction in their wake. They were a people of mystery and legend, their reputation amplified by the terror they struck in the hearts of those who had the misfortune of crossing their paths. But what if I told you that there's more to the Viking story than just blood and battles? Sure, they were fierce warriors, but the Vikings were also skilled traders, navigators, and settlers who helped shape the medieval world in ways that went far beyond their reputation for violence. If you had been a Viking, your life would have been filled with contradictions. One moment fighting in a brutal raid, the next trading goods on the other side of the world. First, let's start with their ships, the longships. These iconic vessels were the lifeblood of Viking society, built for speed, agility, and the ability to navigate both open seas and shallow rivers. These ships were perfect for raiding. The longship could carry dozens of warriors, along with their weapons and supplies, to distant lands in search of plunder. The Vikings were also excellent sailors, using the stars and the winds to guide them across the vast expanse of the ocean. These ships weren't just tools of destruction, they were symbols of Viking power and prestige, designed to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies. But Vikings were not just pillagers, they were traders and explorers. As much as the Vikings are remembered for their violent raids, they were also responsible for creating one of the largest trading networks of the medieval world. Viking merchants sailed from Scandinavia to the far corners of Europe, bringing goods like furs, timber and amber to trade with other cultures. They also ventured into the east, trading with the Byzantine Empire and the Muslim world, even reaching as far as the Caspian Sea. In fact, the Vikings played a key role in the development of the medieval trade routes that connected Europe, Asia and Africa. For the average Viking, life was often about survival, but it was also about exploring new opportunities. If you were a Viking, you might have started your life in a small village in Scandinavia, living off the land, farming and raising animals. The harsh northern climate meant that survival was a daily struggle, and the Vikings developed a fierce work ethic to survive. But there was also a spirit of adventure among the Vikings, a desire to see what lay beyond the horizon. As much as they were feared for their raids, they were also driven by the urge to explore and discover new lands. As you grew older, you might have found yourself drawn to one of the great Viking expeditions. If you were lucky, you would have been chosen to sail on a raid, joining your fellow warriors in a quest for glory, wealth and honour. Raids were often violent affairs. Vikings would attack monasteries, towns and villages, taking prisoners, stealing treasures, and leaving a trail of destruction behind them. The Vikings targeted the riches of the Christian world, with its monasteries and churches, which were often poorly defended and filled with gold and silver. But while the raids were brutal, they were also highly organised. The Vikings had a strict code of conduct when it came to battle, and they were skilled at using their weapons, such as the axe, sword and spear, to devastating effect. Historians still argue about how much of the Viking story is defined by their raids. Some view the Vikings as simple barbarians, driven by greed and a thirst for blood. Others see them as complex individuals, who use their raids as a way to create wealth, expand their territory, and secure a future for their families. The Vikings didn't just raid for the sake of destruction. They were also after land, resources, and opportunities for settlement. They established colonies in places like England, Ireland, Iceland, and Greenland, where they built their own communities and began to assimilate with local populations. In many ways, the Viking Age was as much about migration as it was about conquest. As a Viking, your life would have been shaped by the harsh realities of the world around you. War was a constant presence in Viking society, and many Vikings spent their lives preparing for battle. But even in the midst of this violence, there was a rich culture of storytelling, art and religion. The Vikings had their own pantheon of gods, including Odin, Thor and Freyr, and they believed in a life after death in Valhalla, where brave warriors would feast and fight until the end of time. These beliefs were deeply woven into the fabric of Viking life, shaping their values, actions and decisions. Viking society was also marked by its strong social structure. At the top were the kings and jarls, the noble leaders who ruled over the Viking clans. Below them were the warriors and merchants, followed by the farmers and craftsmen. Women too had an important role to play in Viking society. While they weren't warriors, they were responsible for managing the household, raising children, and making decisions in the absence of their husbands or fathers. Some women even held power, with a few becoming influential figures in Viking society. The most famous of these women is Lagertha, a legendary shield maiden who fought alongside the men in battle. But the Viking way of life was not to last forever. By the end of the 11th century, the Viking raids began to slow down. The rise of more powerful kingdoms in England and France, as well as the spread of Christianity, gradually undermined the Viking way of life. The Vikings began to settle down, integrating into the societies they had once raided. Some of them even converted to Christianity, adopting new ways of life and leaving behind their raiding past. Historians still debate the legacy of the Vikings. Were they simply violent raiders, or were they more than that? Traders, explorers and settlers who helped shape the medieval world? It's likely that they were a bit of both. The Vikings left an indelible mark on the history of Europe, and their influence can still be felt today in the language, culture and traditions of the countries they once ruled. Now that we've explored the world of the Vikings, let's turn our attention to something just as essential to the survival of the medieval world: food. In the Dark Ages, the way people ate, what they ate, and how they prepared food was not only a matter of sustenance, but also a reflection of social class, status, and geography. What did a medieval diet really look like, and how did it shape the lives of the people who lived during this time? Let's dive into the world of medieval cuisine and the strange and sometimes unappetizing meals that kept people alive in an era of constant hardship. The world of medieval food is a bit of a mystery, and depending on where you lived in the Dark Ages, what was on your plate could range from simple staples to extravagant feasts. Imagine sitting down to eat a meal in the medieval world. For most people, this meal would have been humble at best. But whether you were a peasant scraping by with the most basic ingredients, or a noble enjoying the bounty of your land, food in the Dark Ages was often more about survival than pleasure. If you were a peasant, your meals would be basic, relying on whatever crops you could grow or animals you could raise. Most peasants ate a diet that was heavy on grains, especially bread made from barley or oats. Wheat, the prized grain of the medieval world, was typically reserved for the wealthier classes, while peasants were left with coarser, less appetizing varieties. Bread was the backbone of the medieval diet, and for many it was the only thing they could rely on day after day. You might have had bread with every meal, paired with whatever you could gather from the land: vegetables, berries, and maybe a little cheese. The idea of a balanced diet was far from people's minds. If you had meat, it was usually on special occasions or if you could afford it, and it often came in the form of preserved meats, like salted pork or beef. Fasting was a common part of the religious calendar, which also meant that meat was often a rare luxury. In fact, the notion of having meat regularly on your table would have been a dream for most peasants. They had to rely on what they could grow or catch, which was often limited to what the land and seasons allowed. During the colder months, food was scarcer, and the storage of food was vital. You might have salted fish or preserved vegetables to see you through the winter. The limited variety in food was one of the many challenges peasants faced. They ate what they could grow, and the choices were few. If you were lucky enough to live near a river or the coast, fish might have been a regular part of your diet. In medieval Europe, fish wasn't considered a meat, and was therefore a common choice during fasting periods mandated by the church. You might have had herring, cod or eel, often prepared in a variety of ways, smoked, salted or even pickled. Fish, however, wasn't always fresh, and the preservation methods often left it with a strong, pungent flavour that many found hard to tolerate. Now, if you were living in a town or city and had more wealth, your food would have been much more varied and extravagant, and your meals would have been about showing off your status as much as satisfying your hunger. The wealthy elite in the Dark Ages could afford to indulge in foods that were out of reach for the common folk. The nobility's diet included meats like venison, wild boar, and birds such as swan, which were hunted specifically for feasts. These meats would be roasted, boiled, or served in elaborate sauces made from spices that were often imported from the East. The use of spices like pepper, cinnamon, and saffron was a luxury that the rich could afford, adding flavour to their food in ways the peasants could only dream of. Banquets were a common feature of medieval noble life. At these feasts, a wide array of food would be laid out in a lavish display. Imagine platters of roasted meat, pies filled with game, pastries made from rich dough, and large vessels of wine. The food was often served in grand styles with decorations that were meant to impress guests. One of the more bizarre aspects of medieval feasts was the use of decorative food. These were extravagant pieces of food that were designed to catch the eye rather than taste good. You might see a roasted peacock with its feathers still intact, or a pie that, when cut open, would spill out live birds. This wasn't about practicality or nutrition. It was about spectacle, and it was meant to show off the host's wealth and power. What was really fascinating about noble cuisine was the fact that meals were often a symbol of status, not just nourishment. You could tell a lot about a person's wealth and influence by the food they ate, and the more extravagant the meal, the more it showcased their importance. The noble classes had access to fine wines, fruits and cheeses that peasants could never imagine. For the rich, food was an expression of dominance, a way to remind everyone of their position in society. The preparation of these meals was an art in itself. Professional cooks and chefs were often employed to ensure that the food was not only tasty, but also aesthetically pleasing. While the nobles dined on rich meats, elaborate dishes and imported goods, the life of a woman in the lower classes remained focused on simpler, everyday tasks. Women were typically the ones who prepared food in most households, from the simplest peasant fare to the grand feasts of the wealthy. Preparing a meal for your family might mean baking bread, boiling vegetables, and serving whatever meat could be hunted or fished. But for the women of noble households, the pressure to provide an elaborate spread for their guests was immense. It wasn't just about sustenance, it was about social standing. Interestingly, as with everything in the medieval world, food preparation was not just a practical concern, but a deeply religious one as well. The church played a huge role in regulating what people could eat and when. Many people fasted regularly as a form of penance or avoided certain foods during religious holidays. For the medieval Christian, food wasn't just something you ate, it was part of your spiritual life. On certain days, meat was forbidden, and many people would substitute fish, eggs, or dairy for meat during these times. Even the way food was prepared, whether it was cooked or raw, boiled or roasted, could carry religious significance. But with all this focus on what people ate, there was one dark reality that most medieval people had to contend with: the constant threat of hunger. Famine was a real and terrifying prospect. Poor harvests, bad weather, and war could all lead to food shortages that lasted for years. Entire communities could be wiped out by hunger, and the peasantry, already living on the edge of subsistence, would bear the brunt of it. For those living in poverty, food wasn't something to enjoy, it was something to desperately seek and fight for. Even the wealthiest nobles weren't immune to the risks of famine. During periods of scarcity, prices for food could soar, and even the rich could find themselves struggling to fill their bellies. In some cases, kings and nobles had to establish strict controls over the distribution of food to ensure that it reached the people who needed it most. Historians still debate how much food shaped the course of medieval history. Some argue that famine and hunger were a major catalyst for social unrest and revolution. Others claim that the abundance of food in the courts and monasteries allowed for the flourishing of culture, art, and scholarship. The truth, of course, is somewhere in between. Food shaped the lives of all medieval people, whether they were noble or peasant, whether they feasted or starved. It defined their world in good times and bad. As we've seen, food was not just about what was on the table, it was about social status, religion, survival, and the complex relationship between the rulers and the ruled. In the next section, we'll delve into medieval superstitions and magic, exploring how people in the Dark Ages tried to make sense of the world around them through strange beliefs, omens and spells. The Dark Ages were, without a doubt, a time filled with mystery and uncertainty. In a world where knowledge was limited and answers to life's big questions were often elusive, people turned to a different kind of understanding. Superstitions, magic, and belief in the supernatural were all commonplace during this time. People didn't have the scientific knowledge we take for granted today, and so they looked to other sources to explain the events happening around them. Natural disasters, illness, crop failures, and personal misfortune were often attributed to unseen forces, and medieval society was rife with superstitions and magical practices that shaped daily life. If you were living in the Dark Ages, your world would have been defined by a mix of Christian beliefs and a variety of local superstitions. The church wielded enormous power, but even the clergy were not immune to the widespread belief in magic. While the church promoted the idea of faith in God and the sanctity of Christian doctrine, it also recognized the existence of magic. Many medieval priests and bishops believed in the power of miracles, and some even performed healing rituals that incorporated elements of both Christian faith and local folk magic. The church may have frowned upon practices like witchcraft, but it couldn't completely eradicate the ancient beliefs that had existed for centuries. For ordinary people, the line between the sacred and the supernatural was blurry. To cope with the challenges of everyday life, whether it was the fear of disease, death, or bad fortune, people turned to rituals, charms, and spells in an effort to influence their circumstances. You might have worn a protective amulet or a lucky charm to ward off evil spirits or bring good fortune. Perhaps you carried a piece of bone from a saint or a relic believed to have miraculous powers. These items were thought to have the power to protect you from harm, heal illness, or bring prosperity. In a world filled with uncertainty, such items provided a sense of control, even if only a small one. At the same time, medieval people believed strongly in omens and signs. Natural phenomena, like the sudden appearance of a comet, the birth of deformed animals, or even strange weather patterns, were often interpreted as messages from the divine or from supernatural forces. A bad harvest, for instance, might be seen as a sign of God's anger, while an unusual storm or earthquake could be interpreted as a portent of war or disaster. People would often seek out soothsayers or fortune-tellers, hoping for guidance on what the future might hold. These individuals, often women, were believed to possess special powers of insight or divination. They could predict the future, diagnose ailments, or even curse enemies. While some soothsayers were respected, others were seen as dangerous figures, particularly if their prophecies did not align with the teachings of the church. Witchcraft and magic were also deeply intertwined with medieval superstition. While the church condemned witchcraft, accusing witches of making pacts with the devil, people in rural villages still practiced folk magic, believing that spells and potions could cure illnesses, protect against evil spirits, or even bring about love. Some women were accused of witchcraft simply for practicing herbal medicine or performing other healing rituals that had been passed down through generations. In some cases, women who were seen as strange or different could be accused of being witches and subjected to trials or even execution. The witch hunts that would come later in history had their roots in the Dark Ages, with many innocent women and men suffering brutal fates for crimes they did not commit. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval superstition was the belief in magical creatures and beings. Dragons, griffins, and other mythical creatures were believed to inhabit the wilderness, waiting to attack or offer aid to those who ventured too far from civilization. Legends of creatures like the basilisk, a serpent said to have the power to kill with a single glance, were widely believed to be true. People would tell stories about these creatures, sometimes to entertain and sometimes to instill fear. The belief in such creatures wasn't just confined to folklore, it was often reinforced by religious teachings. The Bible, for example, mentioned serpents and dragons, which were interpreted by some as signs of evil or symbols of Satan. These creatures became part of the religious and supernatural fabric of medieval life. Magic and superstition were also a way of coping with the harsh realities of medieval existence. Life in the Dark Ages was uncertain. Disease, famine, and death were ever-present threats, and the future seemed unpredictable. Superstitions offered comfort, providing a framework through which people could understand the chaos around them. If you had lost a loved one to illness, it might have been seen as the result of some malevolent force or a curse. A bad harvest might have been blamed on the evil eye or an angry spirit. People turned to rituals, sometimes dark, sometimes benign, in the hope that they could control their fate. Historians still argue about how much magic and superstition influenced medieval society. Some see the belief in magic as a way of making sense of the unknown, and as a natural extension of medieval people's reliance on faith. Others argue that these superstitions and magical practices were detrimental, leading to witch hunts, social upheaval, and the persecution of the vulnerable. What's undeniable, however, is that magic and superstition were woven deeply into the fabric of medieval life, influencing everything from daily routines to the highest levels of power. Even today, echoes of medieval superstition persist. Some modern traditions, like the belief in luck or the use of charms for protection, can be traced back to these ancient practices. And while we may no longer believe in dragons or witches, the deep-seated desire for control and understanding of the unknown is still part of the human experience. In the next section, we'll delve into one of the most complex and turbulent chapters in medieval history, the Crusades. These holy wars were fought in the name of religion, but their true motivations were much more layered. Were the Crusades a noble cause, or were they about power, land, and conquest? Let's explore the origins of the Crusades, their impact on both Europe and the Middle East, and how they shaped the world we live in today. The Crusades, these holy wars that spanned centuries full of religious fervour, bloodshed, and political intrigue. If you had lived during the time of the Crusades, you would have witnessed the power of religion and the lure of conquest intertwined in ways that forever altered the course of history. These wars were not simply about the religious conflict between Christians and Muslims, as is often portrayed. They were about power, land, wealth, and the desire to leave a legacy. The First Crusade, called in 1095 by Pope Urban II, was launched with the stated goal of reclaiming Jerusalem from Muslim control. The city of Jerusalem was of immense religious significance to Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike, and the idea of reclaiming it in the name of Christianity inspired many to take up arms. Pope Urban's call to arms was a rallying cry for Christian knights, soldiers, and peasants to join the cause, promising them spiritual rewards for their efforts. The promise of forgiveness for sins through participation in the crusade was a powerful motivator for many who saw it as an opportunity to absolve themselves of their past transgressions. Imagine yourself, living in a small village in Europe, hearing the news of the Pope's call. The thought of embarking on a journey to the Holy Land to fight for the faith would have seemed like a divine mission. Thousands, if not more, would have joined the ranks of the Crusaders. Some were knights, eager for glory and the chance to prove their courage. Others were peasants, simply following the call out of religious devotion, or perhaps in search of a better life, as the rewards of land and riches were also promised. The Crusades were an irresistible mixture of piety and ambition. The journey to the Holy Land was not a short one. The Crusaders would travel through treacherous landscapes, often under harsh conditions. Many of them would have crossed the Byzantine Empire and encountered local resistance or political tension. Along the way, they were often faced with shortages of food, disease, and the constant threat of attack by both natural forces and enemies. Some Crusaders, as they marched through foreign lands, would find themselves fighting not only Muslims but also Christians who disagreed with the crusade. The journey itself was dangerous, and many would never see their destination. The First Crusade was ultimately successful for the Christians. In 1099, after months of brutal fighting and besieging, the Crusaders took Jerusalem. The city fell in a bloody conquest. The Christian forces slaughtered many of its inhabitants, including Jews and Muslims. For the Crusaders, it was seen as a glorious victory, but it also marked the beginning of a long and complicated relationship between the Christians and the Muslims of the region. The bloodshed of the First Crusade set the stage for the series of military conflicts that would follow. But the success of the First Crusade didn't mean that the Holy Land was secured forever. The subsequent Crusades, there were 8 in total, spanning from the 11th to the 13th centuries, were attempts to maintain or recapture territories in the Holy Land, as well as to expand Christian influence in the Mediterranean. The Second Crusade, launched in 1147, aimed to capture the Muslim-controlled city of Damascus. However, this crusade ended in failure, and tensions between the Christian Crusaders and the Muslim world only escalated. One of the most famous figures to emerge from the Crusades was Saladin, the Muslim leader who rose to power in the 12th century. Saladin was a brilliant military strategist and a charismatic leader who sought to unite the Muslim world in opposition to the Crusaders. In 1187, Saladin recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders, a significant blow to Christian ambitions. The loss of Jerusalem led to the Third Crusade, which included some of the most famous military leaders of the time, such as King Richard the Lionheart of England, King Philip II of France, and Emperor Frederick III Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire. The Third Crusade, while it achieved some successes, failed to reclaim Jerusalem. The negotiations that followed led to a truce between Richard and Saladin, allowing Christians to visit Jerusalem, but the city remained under Muslim control. This period of the Crusades marked a shift. The early religious zeal began to fade, and by the time of the later Crusades, many of the Crusaders were less motivated by religious fervour and more by political and territorial ambition. Historians still debate the true nature of the Crusades. Were they a righteous struggle for the faith, as the Crusaders believed, or were they driven more by the desire for power and control over strategic lands? The truth is likely a combination of both. The Crusades also had lasting cultural and societal effects. The interaction between the Crusaders and the Muslim world led to the exchange of knowledge, ideas, and goods. The Crusaders brought back with them a wealth of information on science, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy that had been developed in the Islamic world. This knowledge, once brought to Europe, would later contribute to the intellectual renaissance that would transform Europe in the centuries to come. The Crusades also contributed to the growth of trade between Europe and the East, introducing new goods such as spices, silk, and precious metals. However, the legacy of the Crusades was also marked by bloodshed, mistrust, and division. Relations between Christians and Muslims in the Middle East remained strained for centuries, and the memory of the Crusades was used as a rallying cry for future generations. In many ways, the Crusades represent the clash of two worlds, the Christian West and the Muslim East, and the tensions that would continue for centuries. Now that we've explored the religious fervour and conflict of the Crusades, let's take a step back and examine the end of the Dark Ages. The medieval world didn't stay stagnant. Over time, new ideas, technologies, and social structures began to emerge, paving the way for the Renaissance. How did the transition from the medieval world to the early modern period unfold? And what were the lasting impacts of the Dark Ages? Let's explore the dawn of a new era. The end of the Dark Ages marks the beginning of a new era, one of rebirth, innovation, and transformation. By the 15th century, the world was on the cusp of a new age, the Renaissance. But how did this shift occur? The transition from the medieval world to the early modern period wasn't an overnight change. It was a slow process shaped by multiple factors, from the intellectual revival of classical learning to the rise of new technologies and the gradual collapse of the feudal system. The Dark Ages, while often seen as a time of stagnation, actually laid the groundwork for the explosive growth and progress that would follow. At the heart of this transition was the gradual rediscovery of ancient knowledge. During the Dark Ages, much of the learning from ancient Greece and Rome was lost, or at least inaccessible to the majority of people. Monasteries, however, played a crucial role in preserving these ancient texts. Monks copied manuscripts by hand, keeping classical knowledge alive, albeit in limited circulation. As trade and communication between Europe, the Middle East and Asia increased during the High Middle Ages, Europeans began to gain access to the scientific, philosophical and mathematical knowledge that had been flourishing in the Islamic world during the same period. By the 12th and 13th centuries, scholars in Europe began to study ancient Greek and Roman works more closely. This revival of classical learning was accelerated by the development of universities, where students and scholars began to engage with the works of Aristotle, Ptolemy and others. The rise of humanism in Italy further fueled this intellectual awakening. Humanism was a philosophical stance that emphasized the value of human experience and reason, seeking inspiration from the art, literature and ideas of ancient Rome and Greece. Humanists like Petrarch and Erasmus sought to revive ancient ideals and integrate them with contemporary life. It was this intellectual revival that provided the foundation for the Renaissance. But the intellectual resurgence wasn't the only factor driving the end of the Dark Ages. Technological advancements played a critical role as well. One of the most transformative innovations was the printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg in the 15th century. The printing press revolutionized communication by making books and written material more widely available. For the first time, knowledge could be mass-produced, allowing ideas to spread quickly across Europe. This helped to democratize learning, allowing more people, especially those who were not part of the elite, to access books, scientific knowledge, and literature. The printing press also played a key role in the spread of the Protestant Reformation, as Martin Luther's ideas were rapidly disseminated to a wider audience. The development of the printing press was not the only technological breakthrough of this period. The late medieval period also saw advances in navigation and shipbuilding, which would fuel the age of exploration. As European nations began to look outward, seeking new trade routes and territories, they developed better maps, navigational tools, and more advanced ships. This period of exploration, spearheaded by figures like Christopher Columbus and Vasco da Gama, opened up the world in ways that were previously unimaginable. The establishment of new trade routes and the discovery of new lands would lead to the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures on a global scale, reshaping the course of history. The transition from the medieval world to the Renaissance was also marked by the gradual breakdown of the feudal system. The feudal system, which had defined medieval Europe, was based on a rigid hierarchical structure, where land was exchanged for loyalty and military service. But by the end of the Dark Ages, this system was showing signs of collapse. The growth of towns and cities, along with the rise of a merchant class, weakened the power of the old feudal nobility. Kings and monarchs also began to centralize power, diminishing the influence of local lords. The 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453, between England and France played a role in this transformation, as it saw the rise of professional armies and the decline of feudal knights. As the power of kings grew, they began to establish more centralized states, leading to the eventual rise of nation-states that would dominate the coming centuries. With the breakdown of feudalism and the rise of centralized monarchies came the rise of a new economic system. The medieval economy was based primarily on agriculture, and wealth was tied to land. But as trade and commerce expanded during the late Middle Ages, a new merchant class emerged. This class became increasingly wealthy and influential, and they played a key role in financing the exploration and scientific advancements of the Renaissance. The establishment of banking systems, the growth of markets, and the rise of a capitalist economy began to shift the social and economic structure of Europe, moving away from the agrarian-based economy of the Dark Ages. As all these changes unfolded, the Church's authority began to wane. The Catholic Church had been the dominant institution during the Dark Ages, controlling much of the knowledge, education, and political power in Europe. However, by the late Middle Ages, the Church was facing internal challenges. Corruption, the sale of indulgences, and the rise of secularism all contributed to the weakening of the Church's influence. The Protestant Reformation, sparked by Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517, was one of the most significant challenges to church authority. Luther's criticisms of the Church's practices, especially its financial corruption, resonated with many people and sparked a movement that would fracture Christianity in Europe. Despite the upheaval caused by the Reformation, the Renaissance continued to flourish. Artists, writers, and thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, and William Shakespeare would define this period, producing works that have shaped Western culture for centuries. The Renaissance was not just an intellectual and artistic revival. It was a rediscovery of the potential of human creativity and intellect. In this new world, the individual was celebrated, and the pursuit of knowledge, beauty, and discovery became paramount. The legacy of the Dark Ages, often painted as a time of stagnation, can now be seen as a precursor to this great transformation. While the medieval period was undoubtedly a time of hardship and struggle, it also laid the foundation for the rise of modern Europe. The intellectual, political, and technological changes that emerged at the end of the Dark Ages would pave the way for the Renaissance and the eventual rise of the modern world. As we conclude our journey through the Dark Ages, it's important to reflect on the enduring legacy of this period. While the medieval world may seem distant, it continues to shape our lives in many ways. From the arts and culture to the political systems we live under today, the influence of the Dark Ages remains with us. The people of the Dark Ages may have lived in difficult times, but they were also the architects of the world that followed. And in that world, the light of knowledge and progress would eventually emerge, just as it did from the shadows of the past. As we wrap up our exploration of the Dark Ages and the profound changes that led to the dawn of the Renaissance, it's time to reflect on the transition from a period defined by survival, superstition, and religious domination to one that emphasized human creativity, intellectual rebirth, and the quest for individual achievement. The end of the Dark Ages wasn't just a simple shift from one era to another. It was a transformative journey, one that reshaped the course of history and left an indelible mark on the world as we know it today. Looking back, the medieval period seems filled with contradictions. On the one hand, it was a time of great hardship. The feudal system that defined society meant that most people were born into their roles and social mobility was almost non-existent. The peasants who worked the land lived under the constant shadow of famine, disease, and war. Their lives were short and filled with hardship, defined more by survival than by any notion of fulfillment or leisure. The Black Plague, the constant threat of Viking raids, and the brutal realities of feudal warfare painted a grim picture of medieval life. But despite all these struggles, the medieval period was also a time of incredible resilience, innovation, and cultural growth. It was during this period that much of the infrastructure for the world we live in today began to take shape. The Church, though often seen as a force of repression, also preserved knowledge through its monasteries and contributed to the intellectual revival of the Renaissance. The rise of universities, the proliferation of art, and the development of new technologies all found their roots in this tumultuous period. The Renaissance, which followed the Dark Ages, was in many ways an awakening, a rejection of medieval constraints and a renewed focus on humanism, the belief that individuals could shape their own destinies, create beauty, and unlock the secrets of the universe. But it's important to remember that the Renaissance didn't come out of nowhere. It was built on the intellectual and cultural foundations laid during the Dark Ages. Without the work of scholars, monks, and thinkers who preserved ancient knowledge, without the resilience of people who, despite all the odds, managed to create something lasting, the Renaissance might never have happened. This transition from the medieval world to the early modern period also marked a shift in the way power was understood and distributed. Feudalism, with its strict hierarchy and reliance on land, gave way to centralized monarchies, which were later supplanted by the rise of nations and the early stirrings of democracy. The ideas that would drive the political revolutions of the future were beginning to take shape in the minds of thinkers during this period. The political, social, and economic changes that unfolded would not only transform Europe but would eventually have ripple effects across the globe. As the medieval world began to break down, the rise of trade, exploration, and science opened up new possibilities for human achievement. The fall of Constantinople in 1453, the voyages of Christopher Columbus, and the spread of the printing press all played a role in this transformation. These events weren't just markers of the end of one era, they were catalysts that set the stage for the world as we know it today. It's also worth considering the impact of the Crusades on this transformation. While the Crusades are often seen as a dark chapter of religious conflict, they were also a key point of cultural exchange. The contact between the Christian and Muslim worlds during the Crusades led to the exchange of ideas, technologies, and goods. The Crusaders brought back knowledge of Islamic science, mathematics, and medicine, things that would later contribute to the intellectual growth of the Renaissance. In this way, the Crusades were both a force of destruction and a channel for the transmission of knowledge and culture. In a broader sense, the end of the Dark Ages was about shedding the shadows of superstition and fear that had defined much of medieval life. It was about embracing the possibilities of human potential and understanding. The intellectual growth that began during the late Middle Ages didn't just lead to the Renaissance. It paved the way for the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and the modern world. The legacy of the Dark Ages is far more complex than many realize. It was a period marked by suffering, but also by innovation and the quiet resilience of people who, though often oppressed, managed to leave their mark on the world. It was a time that gave birth to the foundations of the world we live in today, a world built on the interplay of knowledge, power, culture, and technology. The medieval period may have been dark in many ways, but out of that darkness came the light of human achievement that would illuminate the centuries to come. Now, as we wind down from this journey through the Dark Ages, take a moment to reflect on the significance of this period. It's easy to dismiss it as a time of ignorance and suffering, but the Dark Ages were, in many ways, the birth pangs of the modern world. The people of the medieval era were not simply trapped in a world of superstition. They were struggling, learning, and building a foundation for future generations. In a sense, the Dark Ages weren't just a time of darkness, they were also the dawn of something much greater, and as we look at the world today, we can trace much of what we know and understand back to this pivotal time in history. Now take a deep breath, and let all the images of the Dark Ages fade into a calm, peaceful conclusion. Let go of the chaos and the conflict, and as you drift off to sleep, remember that history is never as simple as it seems. The past is a complicated tapestry, woven together with both light and dark threads, each one contributing to the story that continues to unfold.